The swarm arrived at dawn. 2,000 vessels emerged from hyperspace, like a plague of metal locusts, and the sight of them filled every sensor display across the Yale. Velith System Overmind Vraxis commanded the armada from his new flagship, and the memory of his previous defeat burned in what passed for his consciousness. The Deathworlders had humiliated him with their virus and their suicidal tactics and their refusal to die properly. This time would be different. This time he brought enough ships to drown them in bodies, broadcast on all frequencies. He commanded. The hybrid fleet received his message, and Admiral Park listened with cold fury in his eyes. Defenders of the Velith sector, Vraxis began. Your resistance has been noted and found admirable, but admiration will not save you. Surrender now, and I will grant your species a quick death. Refuse and I will ensure that your suffering becomes legendary. Park opened a return channel, and his voice carried across the void to every ship in both fleets. This sector is under human protection. You have one chance to withdraw. Vraxis laughed, and the sound was like grinding stone. The Deathworlders think they can threaten 2,000 ships with their collection of scrap metal. Arrogance beyond measure. All forces attack. The swarm surged forward, and the final battle for the Velith Collective began. The hybrid fleet met them head-on, and the space between the two forces became a storm of fire and death. Human and Velith ships fought side by side, and Admiral Park watched from the Defiance, as his impossible alliance, held the line against overwhelming numbers. The virus drones launched again, but Vraxis had prepared countermeasures this time. Only a fraction of the swarm felt a hive-link disruption, and the rest pressed forward with murderous intent. Ships began to die on both sides. The human frigate Inchin was the first to fall, and her crew of 53 died holding a gap in the defensive line. 2 Velith cruisers followed when a swarm carrier broke through and tore them apart with concentrated fire. Lieutenant Commander Yuna led a squadron of mixed human and Velith fighters against the swarm's flank. They fought like demons and destroyed dozens of enemy craft, but the numbers was simply too great. Admiral Yuna reported through a channel crackling with interference. We cannot hold them. They are pushing through on all vectors. Park looked at the tactical display and saw the truth in her words. The hybrid fleet was being overwhelmed for every swarm ship they destroyed. 3 more took its place. He had known this would happen. He had planned for it. All ships. He broadcast, execute Protocol Omega. Protocol Omega was not a tactical maneuver. It was a philosophy. Every remaining ship in the hybrid fleet stopped fighting defensively and began pressing forward into the heart of the swarm. They were not trying to hold the line anymore. They were trying to reach Vraxis's flagship and kill the Overmind. If the head of the swarm died, the body would follow. It was their only chance. Lyra flew at the head of a Velith squadron, and she felt no fear as she guided her ship through the chaos. The training had burned away her hesitation and left only purpose. Her mother and siblings were dead. Her world was ash, but she could still make their deaths mean something. Human command. She broadcast Velith Squadron 7 requesting permission to attempt direct assault on the Overmind's vessel. We have a clear vector. Admiral Park's voice came back immediately. Permission granted, Squadron 7. Give them hell. Lyra pushed her ship to maximum speed, and her squadron followed close behind. Swarm interceptors tried to cut them off, but Yuna's fighters swept in from the side and cleared a path. It was a coordinated dance of death that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago when these species had never fought together. The Overmind's flagship loomed ahead, and Lyra armed the final payload. Her ship carried the last of the Hive-Link virus concentrated in a single warhead. If she could deliver it directly to Vraxis, the disruption would cascade through the entire armada. She punched through the flagship's outer defenses, and her hull screamed as swarm weapons tore at her ship. Warning. Lights flashed across her console, and her engines were failing, and her life support was compromised. It did not matter. She reached the command section and fired the warhead directly into the hull breach. Then she followed it in. Her ship crashed through the inner chambers of the flagship and came to rest in a tangled mass of wreckage. Lyra pulled herself from the ruins and found that she was still alive somehow, and she was inside the Overmind's command center. Raxus turned to face her, and she saw genuine shock in his compound eyes. A Veleth had penetrated his sanctum. Prey had invaded the predator's nest. Impossible. He hissed, "You are herbivores. You are weak. You do not fight." Lyra raised the weapon that Yuna had given her and pointed it at the Overmind. "We learned," she said. She fired. The virus warhead had already begun its work, and Raxus could feel the hive link unraveling around him, but the weapon in Lyra's hands was not a virus. It was something far more personal. The blast struck Raxus in the center of his body, and he staggered backward as pain, unlike anything he had ever experienced, flooded through his neural network. "This is for my mother," Lyra said, and fired again. "This is for my siblings." Again. "This is for 17 worlds." Raxus fell, and the last thing he saw was a Veleth standing over him with human fire in her eyes. When the Overmind died, the swarm armada descended into chaos. Ships began firing randomly and crashing into each other and fleeing in all directions. The hive link was broken, and 2,000 vessels became 2,000 confused animals without guidance or purpose. The hybrid fleet pressed its advantage and destroyed hundreds more before the surviving swarm ships managed to retreat into hyperspace. When it was over, the defenders had lost 15 ships and over 2,000 souls. Admiral Park was dead. The Defiance had finally taken one hit too. Many in her reactor had failed in the final minutes of the battle, but the Veleth Collective survived. 3 months later, the first Earth reinforcement fleet arrived. 60 ships emerged from hyperspace and found a system that was battered and scarred but very much alive. Captain Han Su Min commanded the relief force, and she was met by a delegation of Veleth and the surviving human crew members. Counselor Thess greeted her at the memorial station that had been constructed in orbit. It was a massive structure covered in names, and both human and Veleth had worked together to build it. Over 2,000 humans died defending our people, Thess said as they walked through the memorial halls, and nearly as many Veleth who learned to fight beside them. Han studied the names and recognized several from Academy. They knew the odds when they came here. She said, "Why did they do it?" Thess asked, "Why did your species send 12 ships against an empire?" Han thought about the question for a long moment. "Because that is who we are." She finally replied, "When someone asks for help, we answer, even when it costs us everything." Thess nodded and led her to the central chamber where a recording was waiting. It was his testimony, and he had prepared it for the Galactic Archives. "We activated the beacon hoping for ancient weapons or forgotten technology." Thess's recorded voice began, "The architects sent us humans instead. We did not understand at first what the architects knew. There is no weapon more dangerous than a species that chooses to die for strangers. We hoped for help. We got the Deathworlders Deadliest fleet. Not the largest, not the most advanced, but the one willing to pay any price. We are still here because of that price. We will never forget who paid it." Han wiped a tear from her eye and looked out the Fei viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, the swarm was licking its wounds and remembering what humans had done to them. Somewhere out there, other species were hearing stories about the 12 ships that broke an armada, and somewhere in the endless void, the architect's beacon was still waiting, ready to summon humanity again if anyone else ever needed saving. The Veleth had asked for help. They had received something far more valuable. They had received proof that they were worth dying for. And that was a gift that would echo through the galaxy forever. The war room of the Veleth command station had become Admiral Park's second home in the days following the battle. He stood before a massive holographic display that showed the approaching swarm armada, and the numbers made his stomach turn too. 1,000 ships against 8. The math was impossible by any rational calculation. We need more, he said to the assembled group of human officers and Velith counselors. More ships and more weapons and more people willing to fight. Counselor Thesh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Admiral, you have seen what our people are like. We are not warriors. We do not know how to fight. Then learn. The words hung in the air, and Myra Yuncio watched as the Velith delegates exchanged uncertain glances. She had been serving as translator and cultural liaison between the two species, and she understood the enormity of what Park was asking. The Velith had built their entire civilization on the rejection of violence. Their philosophy taught that all conflicts could be resolved through communication and compromise. War was not just something they avoided. It was something they had convinced themselves was unnecessary. But 17 Burned Worlds said otherwise. I am not asking you to abandon your principles. Park continued. I am asking you to save your people. The swarm does not negotiate. They do not compromise. They consume. And if you do not learn to fight back, then there will be no one left to remember your philosophy. What exactly are you proposing? Thas asked quietly. Give us access to your shipyards and your resources and your volunteers. Let us train your people to fight like humans, not as replacements for your own ways, but as an addition, a desperate measure for desperate times. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours, and voices were raised and old traditions were questioned in ways that would have been unthinkable before the swarm came. In the end, the council voted to allow the training program. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. Lieutenant Commander Seo Yuna was assigned to lead the training effort, and she threw herself into the work with fierce determination. Her first group of Velith volunteers was small, and only about 50 individuals who had lost family to the swarm and were willing to try anything. Among them was a young female named Lyra, who caught Yuna's attention immediately. Lyra was Counselor Thess's daughter, and she had watched her mother and siblings die when their homeworld fell. She did not speak much, but her eyes carried a hardness that Yuna recognized. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. You are afraid, Yuna said to the assembled volunteers on the first day of training. That is natural, and I am not here to take your fear away. I am here to teach you what to do with it. The Velith were not physically suited for combat. They were smaller than humans, and their bodies were designed for running and hiding rather than fighting. But Yuna had studied their physiology and found advantages they had never considered. Their reflexes were faster than human standard. Their eyesight was sharper in low light conditions, and their forearms allowed them to operate complex systems that would overwhelm a two-armed species. You have been told your whole lives that you are prey, Yuna continued. But prey survives by being smarter and faster and more adaptable than predators. Today you start learning how to use those advantages. The training was brutal by Velith standards. Yuna pushed them through simulations and tactical exercises and weapons drills until they collapsed from exhaustion. Many of them quit in the first 3 days, but Lyra stayed, and slowly others began to follow her example. Meanwhile, Mira worked with the civilian population to coordinate evacuations to the outer moons of the system. Dr. Quan Minji ran the operation from her medical ship, the Mercy, and Mira marveled at the woman's tireless efficiency. How do you keep going? Myra asked her one night when they were both too exhausted to sleep. I think about what happens if I stop. Minji replied simply, Have you been recording everything like I asked? Minji nodded and pulled up files on her personal terminal. Every battle and every training session and every moment of this alliance. Someone needs to know what happened here, even if we do not survive to tell them ourselves. Myra looked at the files and saw images of human ships burning and Velith volunteers learning to fire weapons and civilians crowding onto evacuation transports. It was a record of desperation and courage, and the slow transformation of a peaceful species into something harder. The Velith are changing, Myra observed. They are evolving. Minji corrected survival demands adaptation. It is the one law that applies to every species in the universe. The days passed quickly and the hybrid fleet took shape in the Velith shipyards. Human engineers worked alongside Velith technicians to refit civilian vessels with weapons and armor. Velith crews trained on human combat systems, while human advisors learned Velith navigation protocols. It was messy and improvised, and nothing like the professional military forces either species was used to, but it was coming together on the 8th day. Admiral Park called a final briefing. The assembled fleet numbered 34 vessels, now 8 surviving human ships and 26 Velith craft crewed by graduates of UNA's training program. It was still hopelessly outnumbered, but it was more than they had started with. The swarm arrives tomorrow. Park said, "I will not lie to you about our chances. We are facing a force that outnumbers us nearly 60 to 1. Many of us will not survive the coming battle." He paused and looked around the room at the faces of humans and Velith standing together. "But I have seen what happens when our two species work as one. I have seen Velith pilots flying attack runs that would make any human proud. I have seen human medics learning Velith healing techniques to better serve our wounded. This is something the swarm has never faced. Not just humans, and not just Velith, but something new. Something they cannot predict." Lyra stood near the front of the assembly, and Una noticed that she was no longer trembling. The fear was still there, but it had been forged into something harder, something useful. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Park concluded, "know that you have already achieved something remarkable. You have proven that two species can stand together against the darkness. That alone is worth fighting for." The assembly dispersed, and crews returned to their ships. To prepare for the battle to come, Mira found herself standing beside Thess at a viewport overlooking the fleet. "Do you regret activating the beacon?" she asked. Thess was quiet for a long moment. "I thought we were summoning ancient gods to save us," he finally said. "Instead, we got humans. Is that a disappointment?" "No," he replied, and there was wonder in his voice. "It is something better. The gods would have saved us because that is what gods do. Your people are choosing to die for us because that is what humans do. I do not know if we deserve that kind of sacrifice." Myra thought about Admiral Park writing letters to the families of the fallen. She thought about Una pushing herself to exhaustion every day to train volunteers who might die tomorrow. She thought about Minji documenting everything so that someone would remember. "You do not have to deserve it," she said. "You just have to survive long enough to honor it." Tomorrow the sky would burn, but tonight the hybrid fleet stood ready. And for the first time since the swarm arrived, the Velith faced the future with something other than despair. Overmind Vraxis surveyed the approaching battle from the command deck of his flagship and felt only contempt for what he saw. The Velith had always been prey and weak and pathetic and incapable of offering any real resistance. 17 worlds had fallen to the swarm without a single meaningful victory for the defenders. This final push would be no different. His advanced fleet of 312 vessels cut through space like a blade and left nothing but debris in their wake. The swarm had perfected the art of consumption over millions of years, and no species had ever found a way to stop them. Reports indicated that the Velith had somehow acquired allies, and Vraxis had studied the intelligence with mild curiosity. 12. Ships from a species called humans, a Deathworld species that had only recently discovered faster than light travel. They were infants playing at war, and Vraxis almost felt insulted that the architects' beacon had summoned such laughable reinforcements. "Overmind," his communications officer buzzed. "The enemy fleet has formed a defensive line around the Velith station. Show me." The tactical display flickered to life, and Vraxis studied the human formation with growing amusement. They had arranged their ships in a tight cluster with the larger vessels in front and the smaller ones behind. It was a textbook defensive posture that any first-cycle warrior could have predicted. "They mean to hold their ground," Vraxis observed, "admirable but foolish. Shall we proceed with standard encirclement over mind? No. Vraxis decided after a moment of consideration. I want to see what these Deathworlders can do. Send the forward squadrons directly at their center. Let them break themselves against our numbers before we consume what remains. The attack began and 300 swarm vessels surged toward the human line. Vraxis expected the defenders to retreat or scatter or perhaps attempt some desperate maneuver to escape the inevitable. What he did not expect was for them to charge the human flagship accelerated directly into the oncoming swarm, with its weapons firing in all directions. It did not try to evade or minimize damage. It simply pushed forward through a wall of enemy fire and killed everything in its path. Overmind. The tactical officer reported with confusion in his voice. The enemy flagship has sustained multiple direct hits. It should be disabled, and yet it continues to advance. Vraxis watched as the Defiance absorbed punishment that would have crippled any Velith vessel and kept fighting. Its hull was torn and burning in a dozen places, but its weapons never stopped firing. The human frigates followed close behind, and they fought with the same insane aggression. One of them lost its engines to a concentrated barrage, and Vraxis assumed it would drift helplessly until his forces finished it off. Instead, the crippled frigate used its remaining power to rotate toward the nearest swarm carrier and ignited its reactor core. The explosion consumed the frigate and the carrier and 3 escort vessels that had been too close. They destroyed themselves. The tactical officer said with something approaching horror, "They crashed their own ship rather than surrender. Continue the attack." Vraxis ordered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The battle raged for an hour, and Vraxis watched his numerical advantage slowly crumble. The humans did not fight like any species the swarm had encountered before. They did not retreat when damaged. They did not break formation when surrounded. They simply kept killing until they could not kill anymore, and then they found ways to keep killing even then. But the true horror came from the 2 ships that had held back from the main engagement. Vraxis had assumed they were command vessels or perhaps troop transports waiting for the fighting to end. He was wrong. The ships began launching thousands of small objects into the battle space, and Vraxis dismissed them as debris or decoys. They were too small to be weapons and too slow to be missiles. His forces ignored them and focused on the remaining human vessels. That was a mistake. The objects were drones, and they carried a payload that Vraxis would never have anticipated: a virus. Not a computer virus that attacked systems, a biological weapon engineered to target the swarm's most precious advantage, their hive link connection. The first sign of trouble came when Squadron 7 stopped responding to commands. Then Squadron 12. Then the entire eastern flank. Vraxis felt the connection himself, and for the first time in his existence, he experienced what other species called fear. The hive link was failing. Millions of years of evolution had stripped the swarm of individual consciousness. They were a collective intelligence that operated as one mind across countless bodies. Without the hive link, they were nothing but confused animals trapped in shells. They no longer knew how to control Overmind. His communications officer screamed, "I cannot hear the others. I cannot feel them. What is happening to us?" Chaos erupted across the swarm. Fleet as ships began firing on each other, or spinning out of control, or simply going dark as their crews descended into individual mind madness. The humans pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency and picked off the disoriented vessels, one by one. By the time Vraxis managed to rally his remaining forces and retreat, the advance fleet had been reduced to less than 50 functional ships. 12 human vessels had destroyed over 260 swarm warships. The Deathworlders had won Admiral Park. J1 sat in the command chair of the Defiance and stared at the casualty reports with hollow eyes. The Soul was gone, and her crew of 47 souls lost with her. The cargo ship Hammer had burned after the ramming attack, and only 6 of her 30 Crew had made it to escape pods. 2 of the medical ships had taken critical damage while trying to rescue survivors, and 1 would never fly again. In total, 4 ships destroyed and over 600 humans dead. Lieutenant Commander CO Yuna approached him with a datapad in her hands. "Admiral, the Velith are requesting communication. They want to thank us." "What do I tell them?" Park was quiet for a long moment. "Tell them the advance fleet has been neutralized. Tell them we bought them time." But Yuna, he looked up at her and she saw the exhaustion written in every line of his face. "Tell them this was just the beginning. The main swarm armada is still coming. 2,000 ships. And we have 8 vessels left." Yuna nodded and turned to deliver the message through the viewport. Park could see the debris field where so many of his people had died. They had won an impossible victory, but it had cost them dearly. And the real battle was still 9 days away. He pulled up the crew roster and began writing letters to the families of the fallen. It was the duty of a commander, and he would not shirk it, even as exhaustion pulled at his bones. 600 lives traded for time. He could only hope it would be enough. 2 weeks had passed since the beacon sent its signal, and the Velith had spent every day watching the stars with desperate hope in their hearts. When the sensor alarms finally sounded, the entire collective held its breath. Counselor Thess stood at the command center, surrounded by his fellow delegates, as the display screens flickered to life and showed the ships emerging from hyperspace. There were 12 of them. Myra Yumsel watched from her position near the back of the room as the celebration she had expected failed to materialize. Instead, there was only confused silence. "Is that all of them?" Thess asked quietly. "Sensors confirmed 12 vessels." The operator replied. "They are broadcasting human identification codes. 12 ships. The Velith had been hoping for hundreds and perhaps thousands, and instead they received 12 vessels. That looked nothing like the elegant warships of legend. These ships were blocky and industrial, and covered with welded plates and exposed conduits. Some of them still bore the markings of their original purpose as mining haulers and cargo transports. They were ugly in a way that made the Velith delegates shift uncomfortably. "This is Admiral Park J1 of the Earth Response Fleet," came a voice over the communication channel. "We are here to assist the Velith Collective." Thess looked at Mira, and she saw the question in his eyes. She stepped forward and activated her translator. "Admiral Park, this is Observer Yumseo requesting permission to serve as liaison between your fleet and the Velith Council." "Permission granted." "Observer," the Admiral replied, "please arrange a meeting at their earliest convenience." The meeting took place 3 hours later in the same chamber where the beacon had been activated. Admiral Park J1 was a man in his 60s with gray hair, cropped short, and a face that carried the weight of difficult decisions. He stood before the Velith Council with his hands clasped behind his back and explained what Earth had sent. "The flagship is the Defiance," he said while gesturing to a holographic display of his fleet. "It used to be a deep space mining vessel before we retrofitted it with weapons and armor. We have 2 actual military frigates, the Sol and the Inchin, 4 armed cargo ships that can hold their own in a fight, 3 medical vessels equipped to handle mass casualties, and 2 special operations ships carrying classified cargo. This is what you sent." Counselor Venn interrupted with disbelief clear in his voice. "This is what we could send in 2 weeks. Admiral Park replied calmly. "More ships are being prepared, but they will not arrive for months. The swarm has thousands of vessels." Thess said, "Our intelligence suggests their advance fleet alone numbers over 300 ships. I am aware of the numbers." "Counselor, then how can 12 ships possibly make a difference?" Admiral Park looked at the assembled delegates, and Mira saw something in his eyes that she recognized from human history. It was the look of someone who had accepted impossible odds and decided to fight anyway. "We are not here to stop the swarm," he said. "We are here to hurt them badly enough that they will wish they had never heard of this sector." The chamber erupted in confused murmurs, and Mira could see that the Velith did not understand what the Admiral was saying. Their entire philosophy was built around preservation and avoidance and careful retreat. The concept of deliberately engaging a superior force just to inflict damage was foreign to them. You intend to sacrifice yourselves. Thess said slowly, I intend to make them bleed. Admiral Park corrected. Every ship we destroy is one less ship that can threaten your civilians. Every delay we create is more time for evacuations. And if we are lucky, we might just convince them that this sector is more trouble than it is worth. And if you are not lucky, then we die fighting and the next fleet from Earth arrives to find out what happened, and they come back with more ships and more weapons and more anger. You do not know what you are dealing with. Ven said, humans are from what you call a death world, yes? But the swarm has consumed dozens of species. They have fought warriors far more experienced than you. Admiral Park smiled, and it was not a kind expression. With respect, Counselor, the swarm has never fought humans. They have never faced a species that evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill us. They have never encountered people who will crash a burning ship into an enemy carrier just to take it down. With them, we are not here to win. We are here to make them understand that some prey bites back. Mira watched the Velith process this information, and she could see them struggling to reconcile it with everything they knew about war and survival. To them, Admiral Park sounded insane. To Mira, he sounded like every human commander who had ever faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. After the meeting concluded, Mira walked with Admiral Park through the corridors of the Velith station. You scared them, she said. Good, he replied. They need to understand what kind of help they asked for. Did you mean what you said about making the swarm bleed? The Admiral stopped walking and turned to face her. Observer Yumseo, I have 600 crew members across those 12 ships. Most of them volunteered within hours of hearing about this mission. They knew the odds, and they came anyway. Why? Because that is what humans do. He said simply, when someone is in trouble, we help, even when it costs us everything. He resumed walking, and Mira fell into step beside him. The 2 special operations ships, she said. What are they carrying? Something that might give us an edge. He replied, beyond that I cannot say until we know the swarm better. They reached a viewport that looked out at the assembled fleet, and Mira studied the mismatched collection of vessels that represented humanity's response to an extinction level threat. They were ugly and improvised and absolutely nothing like the ancient saviors the Velith had been hoping for. But they were here. And that had to count for something, Admiral. The ship's communication system crackled. Long-range sensors have detected a large formation approaching on Vector 772. How large? Park asked. Over 300 vessels, sir. The swarm's advance fleet. Time to intercept. 18 hours. Admiral Park looked at Myra, and she saw no fear in his eyes, only grim determination. Then we have 18 hours to prepare. He said, tell the council that the first real test is coming, and tell my crews to get some rest. Tomorrow we show these insects what humans are made of. Mira watched him walk away and felt a strange mixture of terror and hope rising in her chest. 12 ships against 300. It was madness by any rational calculation. But humans had never been particularly rational when it came to protecting others. She returned to the command center where the Velith were still trying to process everything they had learned. Thess approached her with questions in his eyes. Your Admiral, he said. Is he typical of your species? Myra thought about all the stories from human history. The last stands and desperate charges and impossible victories. More than you might expect. She replied, is that supposed to comfort me? I honestly do not know. Counselor, but I think you are about to find out what happens when you ask humans for help. Through the viewport she could see the stars, and somewhere beyond them the swarm was coming tomorrow. Would answer all their questions one way or another. The emergency chamber fell silent as the last holographic display flickered to life and showed the devastation of yet another world. Counselor Myra Yunseo stood at the back of the room and watched the faces of the Velith delegates as they processed. What they were seeing, 17 worlds burned in 8 cycles. The cracks. Swarm had come like a plague of locusts made of metal and hunger, and they had consumed everything in their path. Mira was the only human in the chamber, and she felt the weight of that isolation as the Velith Council descended into panic. "We have nothing left," said High Counselor Thess, his forearms trembling as he gestured at the strategic map that showed their remaining territory. It was a small patch of blue surrounded by an ocean of red. The Velith Collective had once spanned 40 star systems, and now they held only 3. Their fleets were shattered and their armies were broken, and their people fled on refugee ships that had nowhere safe to go. Mira had been assigned to this sector as a diplomatic observer 2 years ago when humanity was still new to galactic politics. She had watched the Velith welcome her with curiosity and kindness. They were herbivores by nature and pacifists by philosophy, and they had built a civilization based on art and science and the gentle cultivation of life. They had never developed weapons of war because they had never needed them. The galaxy had seemed peaceful enough, and then the swarm came. "There is one option we have not discussed," said Counselor Venn, the eldest of the assembly. His voice was weak but steady as he activated a hidden panel in the chamber floor. A pedestal rose from the ground, and upon it sat a device that looked impossibly old, the beacon of the architects. Murmurs spread through the chamber as delegates leaned forward to look at the ancient artifact. Mira had heard stories about the architects during her time among the Velith. They were a species that had existed millions of years ago and had supposedly seeded the galaxy with life before vanishing without explanation. Some called them gods, and others called them myths, and most species simply tried not to think about them at all. The legends say this beacon will summon aid from across the stars. Venn continued. It was left here by the architects themselves as a gift to any species facing extinction. Legends, scoffed a younger delegate whose name Mira did not know. "We are scientists, not children believing in fairy tales. We are also desperate." Thess replied quietly, "What do we have to lose by trying?" The debate that followed lasted 3 hours, and Mira listened to every word. She learned that the beacon had been discovered centuries ago in the ruins of an architect outpost. No one had ever activated it because no one had ever faced a threat dire enough to justify the risk. What if it summoned something worse than the swarm? What if it did nothing at all? In the end, the vote was unanimous. They would activate the beacon because doing nothing meant certain death, and doing something meant at least a chance. Thess pressed his palm against the ancient device, and it hummed to life with a sound that seemed to resonate in Myra's bones. Lights flickered across its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and then a beam of energy shot upward through the chamber ceiling and into space. The beacon was searching Myra, watched her personal scanner as it tracked the signal bouncing across the galaxy, and her blood ran cold when she saw where it finally locked on Earth. The beacon had chosen Earth as the source of salvation for the Velith Collective. "The signal has found its target," announced the chamber's sensor operator with obvious relief in his voice. "Coordinates have been transmitted, and a response is being calculated." The delegates erupted in celebration, and Mira saw tears of joy streaming down Thess's face as he embraced his colleagues. They believed they were saved. They thought the architects had known exactly what they were doing when they programmed this beacon millions of years ago. Mira pushed through the crowd until she reached Thess and grabbed his arm with more force than she intended. "Counselor, I need to speak with you privately." Thess looked at her with confusion, but nodded and led her to a small chamber adjacent to the main hall. "What troubles you, observer, Yunseo. This is a moment of hope. That beacon contacted Earth, Myra said. And she could hear the strain in her own voice. I need you to understand what that means. It means the architects knew that your people would be able to help us. My people have been in space for 50 years. Myra replied, we have no great armadas and no superweapons, and no ancient technology hidden away for emergencies like this. She pulled up data on her scanner and showed him the numbers. Earth's entire military fleet consists of about 200 ships, and most of those are assigned to protect our own colonies. But the architects chose your world. Thess insisted, surely they knew something we do not. Or maybe the beacon just found the nearest inhabited planet with a compatible biology. Myra countered, Counselor, I am not trying to crush your hope, but you need to prepare your people for the possibility that whatever Earth sends might not be what you are expecting. Thess was quiet for a long moment, and Myra could see the conflict playing out behind his large dark eyes. He wanted so badly to believe that salvation was coming, and she was asking him to doubt. What would you have me do? He finally asked. Let me send a message to Earth, Myra said. Let me explain the situation in full so that my government understands exactly what is at stake. And what do you think they will send? Myra thought about her homeworld and the people she had left behind. She thought about human history with all its wars and struggles and impossible victories against terrible odds. I think they will send whatever they can, she said honestly. And I think whatever they send will fight with everything it has. Will that be enough? Myra did not answer because she did not know. Thess returned to the celebration, and Myra found a quiet corner where she could compose her message. She wrote and rewrote it a dozen times and tried to capture the desperation of the Velith and the horror of the swarm and the impossible expectations that now rested on humanity's shoulders. In the end, she kept it simple. Emergency. Transmission to Earth Central Command. She began. This is Diplomatic Observer Myra. Yunseo reporting from the Velith Collective. An ancient alien beacon has designated Earth is the response point for an extinction-level crisis. The Velith are facing complete annihilation by a hostile species known as the Crack Swarm. They are expecting salvation. I do not know what we can possibly send them, but I know that we have to send something. The swarm will reach the Velith's final stronghold in approximately 3 weeks. Please respond immediately. She sent the message and watched it disappear into the void of space. Somewhere out there, the swarm was gathering its forces for the final push. Somewhere out there, Earth was receiving news that would change everything. And somewhere in between was Myra standing among people who had placed all their hope in a species they had barely met. She looked out the window at the stars and wondered which of those distant lights would still be shining when this was over. The celebration continued behind her, but she could not bring herself to join. Hope was a beautiful thing, but it could also be cruel when reality failed to match it. She could only pray that Earth would find a way to make the impossible happen, because if they could not, then every gentle soul in this room would be dead within a month, and Myra would die with them. Having failed to save anyone at all,